Evelyn Carter adjusted the strap of her leather laptop bag as she approached the first-class boarding lane. Her tailored blazer and confident stride turned heads, though she paid little attention. This trip wasn't for leisure, it was for her first keynote speech at the annual Global Women in Leadership Summit in Denver. The opportunity to speak about inclusivity and equity, a cause close to her heart, was a milestone in her career. The air smelled of coffee and anticipation as passengers shuffled through the crowded gate. Evelyn caught snippets of conversations around her, families planning vacations, businesspeople hurriedly typing away on laptops. She smiled softly to herself, trying to relax, but there was always something slightly unnerving about boarding a flight. She handed her boarding pass to the gate attendant, who scanned it without a word. Evelyn thanked her anyway and stepped onto the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the metal walkway. The sound echoed, amplifying her nerves. "Good afternoon," said a young flight attendant as Evelyn entered the cabin. Her bright smile was a refreshing welcome. "Your seat is just to the left. 3A. Evelyn nodded, offering her thanks as she slipped into her seat by the window. She stowed her laptop bag beneath the seat in front of her and glanced around. The first-class cabin was filling quickly, professionals with tired faces, a few retirees settling in, and one man engrossed in a thick book. As she pulled out her phone to review her notes for the conference, a sharply polite voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." Evelyn looked up to see Vivian Harris, a flight attendant who appeared to be in her late 40s. Her hair was swept into a tight bun, her uniform impeccable, yet there was something in her tone that felt less welcoming than it should have. "Can I see your ticket, please?" Vivian asked. Her lips curved into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Evelyn raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling her boarding pass from the inside pocket of her blazer. Vivian examined it, her eyes lingering on the seat assignment for just a moment too long before handing it back. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped. Sometimes passengers get confused about seating. Evelyn felt a prickle of annoyance. "Not me," she replied evenly. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." Vivian hesitated, her smile faltering for the briefest of moments before she straightened and moved on. Evelyn watched her retreat, the flight attendant's posture stiff as she made her way down the aisle. A low murmur reached Evelyn's ears. A comment passed between Vivian and another flight attendant, but the words were lost in the hum of the cabin. Deciding it wasn't worth dwelling on, Evelyn refocused on her phone. She was skimming through a list of key points for her speech when the cabin doors closed, signaling the final call for passengers. Her nerves began to settle as the plane taxied to the runway. Yet, a sense of unease lingered. The plane had been in the air for less than 30 minutes when the first spark of tension reignited. Evelyn was absorbed in an email draft when she felt a light tap on her arm. She looked up to find Vivian standing over her, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am," Vivian began, her smile more strained than before. "I need to speak with you about your seat." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Is there a problem?" "There seems to have been an error in the seating arrangement," Vivian said, glancing at the clipboard as if confirming something. "This seat may have been assigned incorrectly. We'd like to move you to another one in the main cabin." Evelyn stared at her for a moment, trying to process the words. "I'm sorry, but this is the seat I paid for. First class. 3A. Yes. Well," Vivian's smile thinned. "Sometimes these things happen. I'm sure we can resolve this without any fuss." "I'm not causing any fuss," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "I'm staying in my assigned seat." Vivian's lips pursed as her eyes darted around, as though looking for support. "I'd like to avoid escalating this," she said, lowering her voice. "So would I," Evelyn shot back. "So unless you have a legitimate reason for asking me to move, I suggest we leave it at that." The quiet tension of their exchange drew the attention of nearby passengers. A man in the adjacent row looked up from his tablet, his eyes flicking between them. A soft whisper carried from somewhere behind Evelyn, and she could feel the weight of the stares. Still, she held her ground. Vivian sighed audibly, straightened, and turned on her heel. Evelyn watched as she retreated down the aisle, muttering something under her breath. Evelyn settled back in her seat, attempting to refocus on her work. The hum of the engines and chatter of nearby passengers blended into white noise. She tried to brush off the strange encounter, but her unease lingered. The flight attendants passed through the cabin offering drinks, and Evelyn noticed that Vivian seemed to avoid her row entirely. It wasn't just avoidance, it was deliberate. When another flight attendant, younger and visibly nervous, brought Evelyn her drink, the tray wobbled slightly as she placed it down. The girl muttered a quick apology before rushing off, and Evelyn caught Vivian watching from the galley, her expression unreadable. Evelyn's patience started to wear thin. What exactly was Vivian's problem? It wasn't the first time she dealt with microaggressions in professional settings. But this felt different. The scrutiny, the whispers, the forced smiles. It was becoming impossible to ignore. When Vivian returned to her row, clipboard in hand once again, Evelyn's irritation bubbled over. "Ma'am," Vivian began, her tone formal. "I'm going to have to insist." "No," Evelyn interrupted firmly. "I've already explained that I'm staying in my seat. Unless you have a specific, legitimate reason for this, stop harassing me." Vivian's face reddened, and for a moment, her composure cracked. "There's no harassment, ma'am. I'm simply doing my job." "Then do it somewhere else," Evelyn said evenly. "Unless you'd like me to speak with your supervisor about your behavior." That seemed to catch Vivian off guard. She hesitated, clipboard clutched tightly, before retreating once more. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. But Evelyn refused to look around. She focused instead on her laptop, hoping the confrontation had ended. It hadn't. Less than 10 minutes later, Evelyn noticed Vivian speaking in hushed tones with a male colleague. The man nodded reluctantly before approaching Evelyn's row. His demeanor was apologetic, but his presence alone set Evelyn's nerves on edge. "Ma'am," he said softly, crouching slightly to meet her eye level, "we're going to need you to cooperate." Evelyn set her laptop aside, her frustration finally boiling over. "And what exactly does cooperate mean? I'm in my assigned seat, and I've done nothing wrong." The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Vivian, who was watching intently from the galley. "There's been a discrepancy." "There's no discrepancy," Evelyn interrupted. "What there is, however, is a flight attendant who seems determined to make me feel unwelcome." "Ma'am, please, save it," Evelyn snapped, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of passengers nearby. "You want me to move? Fine, call the captain. Better yet, call security. Let's see how far you're willing to go." Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that neither the man nor Vivian seemed eager to meet. Passengers in the adjacent rows began murmuring openly, and Evelyn caught the sympathetic gaze of a middle-aged woman a few rows back. The man cleared his throat. "I'll let the captain know." "Please do," Evelyn said, crossing her arms. The cabin settled into uneasy silence as the captain emerged from the cockpit. A tall, graying man with a calm yet stern demeanor. He walked directly to Evelyn's row, his presence commanding attention. Vivian trailed behind him, her expression tight. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, addressing Evelyn directly. "I'd like to know the same thing," Evelyn replied. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for, and I've been repeatedly asked to move without any valid reason." The captain turned to Vivian. "Miss Harris, is there a legitimate issue with this passenger's ticket?" Vivian hesitated, and in that brief pause, Evelyn saw her confidence waver. "There was a concern about the booking," Vivian said carefully. "We wanted to ensure everything was in order." The captain frowned. "And was it?" "Yes, but then I see no issue," the captain said, cutting her off. He turned back to Evelyn. "Miss, I apologize for any inconvenience. Please remain in your seat." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you." The captain's gaze lingered on Vivian for a moment, a silent reprimand, before he returned to the cockpit. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers exchanging glances and whispers. Evelyn could feel their eyes on her, some supportive, others indifferent, and a few judgmental. She ignored them all. Vivian retreated to the galley, her movements stiff and jerky. Evelyn exhaled, her body still tense from the encounter. She picked up her laptop, determined to distract herself, but her focus had been shattered. In the back of the plane, Kyle Dawson, a tech-savvy college student seated in coach, adjusted his phone discreetly. He'd been recording since Vivian's first interaction with Evelyn, his instincts telling him this was a story worth capturing. As the confrontation played out, Kyle uploaded the footage to his social media account with a simple caption, "This is what flying while black looks like." The video spread faster than Kyle could have anticipated. Within hours, it racked up thousands of views, then tens of thousands. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to disbelief. By the time the flight landed, the incident was already trending. Evelyn had no idea what awaited her on the ground. The plane touched down with a sense of relief. But Evelyn's nerves remained frayed. She was among the last to disembark, wanting to avoid the hurried crowd. As she stepped into the terminal, a cacophony of voices and the flash of cameras stopped her in her tracks. A crowd of reporters had gathered, their microphones and cameras pointed in her direction. For a moment, Evelyn froze. How had word of the incident spread so quickly? "Miss Carter," one of the reporters called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "Can you comment on what happened during your flight?" Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't prepared for this. A younger man approached her from the side, his demeanor calm but urgent. "Evelyn, I'm Kyle Dawson. I recorded what happened. Your story is already out there, it's trending everywhere." She stared at him, processing his words. "You recorded it?" Kyle nodded. "People are outraged. You don't have to do this alone. I just thought you should know." Before Evelyn could respond, the reporters closed in. She took a deep breath, her professional instincts kicking in. If this story was already out, she wasn't going to let someone else control the narrative. "What happened today was unacceptable," she began, her voice steady despite the cameras. "I was singled out, humiliated, and repeatedly asked to leave a seat I paid for, with no valid reason. This isn't just about me. It's about the broader issue of how people are treated differently because of the way they look." The reporters fired off more questions, but Evelyn held her ground, answering only what she felt was necessary. By the time she left the terminal, her words had already been shared and amplified across countless platforms. Back at the airline's headquarters, the incident had reached crisis levels. The video was impossible to ignore, with millions of views and thousands of comments flooding their social media accounts. The hashtag flying while black was trending, and the public backlash was relentless. In a dimly lit conference room, the airline's executive team gathered, their faces tense. Melissa Grayson, the company's head of public relations, was visibly stressed as she addressed the room. "This is a nightmare," she said, her voice tight. "The video is everywhere, and the response is overwhelmingly negative. We need a statement, now." Martin Gray, the airline's CEO, frowned. "What's the status of the internal investigation?" "It's barely started," Melissa admitted, "but the public isn't going to wait for us to finish. We need to act immediately." "Fire Vivian Harris," another executive suggested. "Make it clear she doesn't represent the company." Melissa hesitated. "Firing her might appease some people, but it won't solve the underlying issue. The public wants accountability from us, not just one employee." Martin sighed heavily. "Then we announce a review of our policies. Diversity training, whatever it takes to calm this storm." The decision was made, but Melissa knew it wouldn't be enough. The damage had already been done. Evelyn spent the evening trying to process the day's events. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, calls, and social media notifications. Kyle had sent her the video he'd recorded, and watching it was both validating and painful. Her lawyer, Daniel Morales, called her later that evening. His voice was calm but firm, a stark contrast to the chaos around her. "Evelyn, I've reviewed the video and the statements you've made," he said. "You have a strong case. If you want to pursue legal action, I'm ready." Evelyn hesitated. She wasn't the type to seek conflict. But this wasn't just about her anymore. The overwhelming support she'd received online made her realize how many people were watching and waiting. "I want to move forward," she said finally. "This isn't just about me. It's about changing how these situations are handled." Daniel nodded on the other end. "Then we'll start with a formal demand letter. They'll likely try to settle, but we'll push for systemic changes." As the days passed, more voices joined the conversation. Former employees of the airline began sharing their own experiences with discrimination, while passengers recounted similar incidents. The narrative grew beyond Evelyn's story, becoming a rallying cry for accountability. Under immense pressure, the airline released a public statement. "We are aware of the incident involving a passenger on Flight 127 and take these matters very seriously. We have launched an internal investigation and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. We apologize for any distress caused and are taking immediate steps to address this situation." The statement was met with widespread criticism. Social media users and journalists alike called it hollow and performative. demanding tangible action rather than vague promises. Evelyn wasn't impressed either. She forwarded the statement to Daniel, adding a simple note: "This isn't enough." Daniel agreed. "They're trying to protect their image without addressing the real issues. We'll push harder." The legal battle began in earnest. Evelyn filed a lawsuit against the airline, alleging racial discrimination and negligence. The case garnered even more media attention, with civil rights organizations offering their support. In response, the airline scrambled to regain control. They announced mandatory diversity training for all employees and established an oversight committee to review complaints. But for many, it felt like too little, too late. Evelyn's resolve only grew stronger. She began speaking at events and appearing on panels, using her platform to advocate for systemic change. Her story resonated with people across the country, sparking a movement that went far beyond her own experience. The days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of preparation and tension. Evelyn worked closely with Daniel and his team, poring over witness statements, analyzing company records, and reviewing every second of the video footage. "Vivian Harris is going to be their scapegoat," Daniel said during one of their strategy meetings. "They'll argue that her actions were an isolated incident. But we know better. This is about a culture of discrimination." Evelyn nodded. "We need to show the jury that this wasn't just one bad employee. This was enabled by a system that ignored complaints and allowed her behavior to thrive." Their team brought in additional witnesses: former flight attendants who had worked with Vivian, passengers who had experienced similar treatment, and experts in corporate accountability. The evidence painted a damning picture of the airline's negligence. As the trial approached, the media coverage intensified. Evelyn found herself at the center of a national conversation about systemic racism in the airline industry. Interviews, op-eds, and think pieces flooded news outlets and social media platforms. One evening, Evelyn sat down for a live interview with a prominent journalist, Laura Whitman. The studio lights were bright, and the cameras rolled as Laura began. "Miss Carter, your story has sparked a national dialogue about discrimination in air travel. How does it feel to be at the forefront of this movement?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "It's overwhelming, but also empowering. I didn't set out to be a spokesperson for this issue. But if my experience can lead to meaningful change, then it's worth it." Laura leaned forward. "The airline has announced new policies and mandatory diversity training. Do you think that's enough?" "No," Evelyn said firmly. "Policies and training are only effective if they're implemented with accountability. This isn't just about checking a box, it's about changing a culture." Her words resonated with viewers, and the interview quickly went viral. Messages of support poured in, along with stories from people who had faced similar injustices. The courtroom was packed as the trial got underway. Evelyn sat beside Daniel, her heart pounding as the judge entered and called the proceedings to order. The airline's legal team opened with a predictable defense, arguing that Vivian Harris' actions were unprofessional but not indicative of systemic issues within the company. "Our client regrets the incident," the lead attorney said, "but this was a misunderstanding, not a pattern of behavior." Daniel countered with a compelling opening statement, emphasizing the documented complaints against Vivian and the airline's repeated failures to act. "This isn't about one flight attendant," he said, his voice firm. "It's about a company that turned a blind eye to discrimination until they were forced to face the consequences." The jury listened intently as witnesses took the stand. Former employees recounted Vivian's history of targeting certain passengers, and experts testified about the airline's lack of effective oversight. The video footage was played, its impact undeniable. When it was Evelyn's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She recounted the events of that day with calm precision, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to rise. "I was treated as if I didn't belong," she said, "not because of my behavior, but because of assumptions based on the color of my skin. That's not just wrong, it's unacceptable." The airline's attorney attempted to discredit her, suggesting that she had overreacted or sought publicity. But Evelyn held her ground, her responses measured and unwavering. "I didn't ask for this attention," she said, "but now that it's here, I'm going to use it to make sure no one else has to experience what I did." The trial reached a critical moment when Vivian Harris herself took the stand. Her demeanor was defensive, and her attempts to justify her actions only served to highlight her biases. Daniel pressed her relentlessly. "Miss Harris, Can you explain why you repeatedly questioned Miss Carter's right to be in her assigned seat, despite clear evidence that she belonged there? Vivian stammered. I was following protocol. Protocol? Daniel repeated. Or prejudice? Because the evidence shows that your actions were anything but professional. The jury's expressions made it clear that Vivian's testimony had done more harm than good to the airline's case. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Evelyn sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart racing as the foreperson stood. In the case of Carter versus Meridian Airlines, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Miss Evelyn Carter. A wave of relief washed over Evelyn as the courtroom erupted in murmurs. The jury awarded her significant damages and mandated that the airline implement comprehensive anti-discrimination reforms. The verdict sent shockwaves through the industry. Evelyn's case became a landmark moment, inspiring other victims of discrimination to speak out and demand accountability. Meridian Airlines announced sweeping changes, including the creation of an independent oversight board to handle complaints. Evelyn continued to use her platform to advocate for change, speaking at conferences and working with civil rights organizations. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew that progress was possible. One evening, as she prepared for another public appearance, Evelyn received a message from Kyle. It was a simple note, but it meant the world to her. You made history. Thank you. Evelyn smiled, her resolve stronger than ever. The journey had been grueling, but it had also been transformative. She had turned pain into purpose, and now she was determined to keep walking the path toward justice. Evelyn Carter stood at the podium of a crowded auditorium, the bright stage lights framing her in the center of a sea of faces. She adjusted the microphone, her voice clear and resonant. Thank you all for being here today. What happened to me is not just my story, it's the story of countless others who have been silenced or ignored. Together, we're going to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did. The audience erupted into applause, a powerful affirmation of her journey from victim to advocate. Evelyn had spent months since the trial speaking out at events, collaborating with policymakers, and advocating for systemic reform. Her case had inspired legislation aimed at protecting passengers from discrimination in the airline industry. The proposed law, informally dubbed Evelyn's Act, called for stronger accountability measures, transparency in handling complaints, and mandatory diversity training for airline employees nationwide. At Meridian Airlines, the fallout continued to ripple. The CEO, Gregory Miles, sat in a tense boardroom meeting as his legal and PR teams dissected the aftermath of the trial. We've made the reforms public, one executive said, gesturing to a stack of papers. But the damage to our reputation is significant. Gregory frowned. How much time do we have before the next wave of lawsuits? Rachel Bennett, the company's legal advisor, sighed. We're already seeing other passengers come forward. Some have strong evidence, others don't, but the perception is what matters. Gregory rubbed his temples. We need to do more than just damage control. We need a complete overhaul. If we don't, this company won't survive another year. Meanwhile, Evelyn was hard at work with a newly formed coalition of activists, lawyers, and industry experts. Together, they had launched an initiative to collect stories from other passengers and employees who had faced discrimination in the airline industry. The stories poured in, thousands of them. Evelyn read each one with a mixture of anger and determination. A single mother denied a seat she paid for because of a clerical error. A black flight attendant who was consistently passed over for promotions. A transgender passenger forced to endure invasive questioning at the gate. This isn't just an airline problem, Evelyn said during a coalition meeting. This is a cultural problem. If we want real change, we have to go beyond one company. The coalition began drafting a white paper, detailing the systemic issues they had uncovered and proposing actionable solutions for the entire industry. Far from the public eye, Vivian Harris was struggling to rebuild her life. She had been fired from Meridian Airlines, and her reputation was in shambles. Friends and family distanced themselves, and she faced constant online harassment. Sitting alone in a small cafe, Vivian scrolled through an article about Evelyn's latest speech. Her hands trembled as she read the headline, Evelyn Carter leads fight for airline accountability. A part of her was bitter, convinced that she had been unfairly vilified. But another part of her, one she rarely acknowledged, felt the weight of guilt. She knew deep down that her actions on that flight were indefensible, and that she had contributed to a larger problem. Vivian sighed, closing her laptop. For the first time, she wondered if she could find a way to make amends. Months later, Evelyn stood on the steps of Capitol Hill, surrounded by lawmakers and advocates. The passage of Evelyn's Act was a monumental victory, the culmination of relentless advocacy and collaboration. This is proof that when we come together, we can achieve meaningful change, Evelyn said to the gathered crowd. But our work isn't done. This is just the beginning. The act mandated strict oversight for airlines, requiring them to report discrimination complaints publicly and submit to annual audits. It also established an independent body to investigate complaints, ensuring accountability beyond the corporate structure. The momentum of Evelyn's case extended far beyond the United States. Activists in other countries began sharing their own stories of discrimination in travel and calling for similar reforms. Evelyn traveled internationally, meeting with advocates and policymakers to share her experiences and lend her voice to a global movement. She spoke at the United Nations, emphasizing the need for equity and dignity in all forms of travel. This isn't just about one industry, she said during her speech. It's about how we treat one another. It's about recognizing our shared humanity. One evening, Evelyn sat on her apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling around her. She sipped a cup of tea, her thoughts drifting to the whirlwind of the past year. Kyle called, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey, how's the international activist life treating you?" Evelyn laughed. "Exhausting, but worth it. How about you? Still snapping photos of coffee cups and sunsets?" "Guilty," Kyle replied with a chuckle. "I've been following your journey. You've done something incredible." Evelyn's smile softened. "It doesn't feel real sometimes. But then I remember why I started. And it all makes sense." As they talked, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. The fight was ongoing, but she had found her purpose, and she knew she wasn't alone in it. Years later, Evelyn's work had transformed the airline industry. Policies had changed, accountability had increased, and countless passengers had experienced the benefits of her advocacy. In her hometown, a community center was named in her honor, dedicated to educating and empowering individuals to stand up against discrimination in all its forms. Evelyn stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, she looked out at the crowd, her heart full. "This isn't just my legacy," she said, "it's ours. Together, we've shown that change is possible, and that it's worth fighting for." As the applause echoed around her, Evelyn knew her journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, but she was ready for whatever came next. As Evelyn Carter's profile grew, so did her understanding of the deeper, systemic nature of racial discrimination. The stories she encountered went beyond the airline industry. Housing, employment, education, and policing were all rife with similar patterns. It became clear that the fight for justice had to extend far beyond the confines of airport terminals and boarding gates. Sitting in a meeting room with her coalition of activists and lawyers, Evelyn laid out her vision for the next phase of their work. "We've made strides in one industry," she began, her voice steady but passionate. "But racism doesn't stop at the boarding gate. If we don't address the broader systems that perpetuate inequality, our progress here won't be enough." The coalition agreed to broaden their mission, shifting their focus to systemic racism across multiple sectors. Evelyn's experience became a rallying cry for a national movement, one that sought to confront the structures enabling prejudice in all its forms. One of the coalition's first initiatives was to analyze data on racial disparities across industries. They partnered with statisticians and sociologists, creating reports that painted a stark picture. In housing, minority applicants were 56% more likely to face rejection, even with identical qualifications. In employment, resumes with ethnic-sounding names received 50% fewer callbacks. In education, Black and Latino students were suspended at disproportionately higher rates than their white peers for similar infractions. Evelyn stared at the figures in disbelief. "This isn't subtle," she said during a team meeting. "This is systemic, intentional, and devastating." The coalition launched a public campaign, using the data to highlight how discrimination shaped every aspect of life for marginalized communities. They organized town halls, rallies, and social media campaigns, aiming to educate and mobilize the public. Evelyn also turned her attention to corporate accountability. She worked with whistleblowers who exposed discriminatory hiring practices and toxic workplace cultures in major companies. These revelations often led to public outrage and demands for reform. One particularly damning report exposed a major tech company where black employees made up less than 2% of leadership roles despite accounting for 10% of the workforce. Evelyn spoke at a press conference alongside former employees who shared their experiences of being marginalized and excluded. "This isn't just about one company," Evelyn said to the assembled press. "It's about an entire culture that values diversity as a marketing tool but refuses to enact meaningful change. That ends now." The pressure worked. Within weeks, the company announced sweeping changes, including increased transparency in hiring practices, mandatory bias training, and investment in mentorship programs for employees of color. Not everyone welcomed Evelyn's work. The backlash was fierce, particularly from groups and individuals who dismissed her efforts as divisive or unnecessary. Social media platforms became battlegrounds, with Evelyn often targeted by hateful comments and even threats. "You're making things worse," one message read. "Stop playing the victim." Evelyn refused to be silenced. She addressed the criticism head-on in interviews and public appearances. "Acknowledging inequality isn't divisive," she said during a televised debate. "Ignoring it is. The discomfort some people feel is a small price to pay for creating a fairer, more just society." Despite the resistance, Evelyn also sought to engage with individuals and groups who were willing to listen and learn. She organized workshops where participants could openly discuss their biases and misconceptions without fear of judgment. One such session included a young woman named Emma, who confessed to holding prejudices she didn't fully understand. "I grew up hearing things that made me think differently about people who didn't look like me," Emma admitted. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Evelyn's approach was patient but firm. "Change starts with acknowledging where we've been," she told Emma. "It's not about guilt, it's about responsibility." These workshops proved transformative for many participants, fostering dialogue and understanding in communities divided by race and class. Evelyn's work began to resonate internationally. She was invited to speak at global summits and collaborate with activists from countries grappling with their own histories of racial inequality. In South Africa, she toured townships where apartheid's legacy still lingered. In France, she met with leaders addressing the marginalization of immigrants and refugees. During a United Nations panel, Evelyn delivered a powerful speech that drew on her personal experiences and the collective stories she had encountered. "Racism is a global issue," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "It may take different forms in different places, but the pain it causes is universal. Our fight is not against individuals, it's against the systems that thrive on division and oppression. Together, we can dismantle them." Her words were met with a standing ovation, cementing her status as a leading voice in the global movement for racial equity. One day, Evelyn received a letter from a high school student named Marcus who had been inspired by her story. "Because of you," he wrote, "I stood up to a teacher who treated me unfairly. I'm planning to study law so I can fight for justice. Just like you." Evelyn read the letter with tears in her eyes. It reminded her why she had started this journey, and why she couldn't stop. She reached out to Marcus, offering to mentor him and others like him who wanted to make a difference. Through scholarships, mentorship programs, and youth leadership initiatives, Evelyn ensured that the next generation would have the tools they needed to continue the fight for equality. Years later, Evelyn's impact was undeniable. Policies had changed, conversations had shifted, and countless lives had been touched by her work. But Evelyn remained humble, knowing that the fight against racism was ongoing. As she stood before a crowd at a rally commemorating the 10th anniversary of Evelyn's Act, she reflected on how far they had come, and how much further they had to go. "Our work is not done," she said, "but every step forward is a victory. Every story shared, every system challenged, every life changed, that's how we win." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices merging into a powerful chorus of hope and determination. Evelyn smiled, feeling the weight of the moment, and the promise of the future. Evelyn's fight had sparked a wave of legislative reforms. Evelyn's Act, which mandated corporate transparency and stricter anti-discrimination laws, became the cornerstone of her legacy. However, the implementation of these changes required vigilance. Evelyn worked tirelessly to ensure the legislation didn't just sit on paper but actively transformed lives. She collaborated with state and federal agencies to establish oversight committees. These groups were responsible for auditing corporations and public institutions to ensure compliance with the new laws. Evelyn insisted on diverse representation within these committees, ensuring they weren't just token efforts but real agents of change. At one meeting with the Department of Justice, Evelyn made her stance clear. Accountability can't be optional. These laws are the foundation, but enforcement is the building. Without it, we're just laying bricks in an empty field. As her work expanded, Evelyn began to feel the weight of her mission pressing down on her. The long hours, constant travel, and unrelenting scrutiny took a toll on her mental health. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying moments of resistance and doubt. One evening, her closest friend, Maya, visited her apartment. "You need to take care of yourself, Evie," Maya said, handing Evelyn a cup of tea. "You can't pour from an empty cup." Evelyn sighed, her shoulders slumping. "There's just so much to do. Every time I think we've made progress, another story surfaces: a family evicted, a worker denied a promotion, a student suspended for speaking up. You've already changed so much," Maya reminded her, "but you're not alone in this fight. Let others carry the load with you." Evelyn took those words to heart. She began delegating more responsibilities to her team, trusting them to carry forward the work. She also sought therapy, learning to balance her personal well-being with her public mission. Despite her success, Evelyn encountered fierce resistance from entrenched corporate interests. Some companies openly pushed back against Evelyn's act, claiming it stifled business innovation. Lobbyists worked behind the scenes to water down enforcement mechanisms, and smear campaigns sought to discredit Evelyn and her allies. One corporation even filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the act. Evelyn attended the court hearings, sitting quietly as the company's lawyers argued that the law imposed undue burdens on businesses. When it was time for her to testify, Evelyn's words were unflinching. "The burden of inequality has been borne by marginalized communities for far too long," she told the court. "If ensuring fairness feels like a burden, then perhaps we should question the values of those who resist it." The case gained national attention, with activists rallying outside the courthouse. Ultimately, the court upheld the law, marking another victory for Evelyn's movement. While most of Evelyn's work focused on systemic change, she also prioritized building bridges between communities. She launched a national tour, hosting dialogues in cities and rural towns alike. These sessions brought together people of different races, socioeconomic backgrounds, and political beliefs. In one small town, Evelyn met an elderly white man named Gerald who had grown up with deeply ingrained biases. During the dialogue, Gerald stood and shared his story. "I was taught to see people as us and them," he admitted. "But seeing you here, fighting for justice with such dignity, makes me realize how wrong I've been." Evelyn approached Gerald after the event, thanking him for his honesty. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "but acknowledging where we've been is the first step toward where we need to go." These dialogues weren't always easy. Some turned hostile, with attendees accusing Evelyn of pushing an agenda. But she remained patient, believing that even the smallest breakthroughs were worth the effort. Evelyn's work began to garner international acclaim. She was invited to address the United Nations on the intersection of race and economic inequality. Standing before world leaders, Evelyn spoke with the same conviction that had driven her since the incident on the flight. "Racism is not confined to one country or one institution," she said. "It's woven into the fabric of our global systems. But just as it's systemic, so too must our solutions be. Collaboration, accountability, and empathy. These are the tools we need to dismantle injustice." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and several countries reached out to her afterward, seeking advice on implementing similar reforms. Years passed, and Evelyn's movement grew into a global force. Organizations she had founded flourished under new leadership, ensuring the work would continue even as she began to step back from the front lines. One day, she attended the grand opening of the Carter Center for Equity and Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to combating systemic racism worldwide. The center was funded by donations from individuals, corporations, and even some governments, a testament to the widespread impact of Evelyn's work. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation she had faced on that flight had ignited a fire. But it was the stories of countless others that had kept it burning. "We've come a long way," she said in her speech. "But the fight for justice doesn't end. It's a journey that each generation must take up, building on the progress of those who came before." Evelyn spent her later years mentoring young activists and writing a memoir about her experiences. Titled Unbroken Wings, the book became a bestseller, inspiring a new wave of leaders to take up the fight for equality. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset, Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace. She had turned pain into purpose, injustice into action, and division into dialogue. Her phone buzzed with a message from a young woman named Clara, who had recently joined one of the organizations Evelyn founded. "Thank you for paving the way." The message read, "Because of you, I believe we can change the world." Evelyn smiled, typing a reply, "The world is already changing. Keep going." With that, she set her phone aside, her heart full of hope. The work was far from over, but Evelyn knew it was in good hands. The path to justice was long, but she had walked it with purpose, and others would continue the journey.